Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world, said our very own Nelson Mandela. Today, I want to talk to you about re-education, the path to transformational education outcomes. We would all be quite hard-pressed to find someone who will dispute the value of education. Unless, of course, you're an oppressor who's trying to deny people an education. But even then, you know that the lack of education allows you to control people. There isn't a place in the world that I love more than this continent, and we are so much in need of a skilled and productive workforce. We have to be able to build that in order to achieve the levels of prosperity and economic growth that we seek. And that means we have to upskill and capacitate people faster than we have ever done before. My interest in education really stems from having observed my own parents. And it's really about the stunning differences in the life outcomes between them, the people they grew up with, their peers, and even their relatives. I still can't get over how the education system feels like it's a lottery ticket. And you don't know who's going to make it and who's going to benefit and why. And what's the difference between those who make it and those who don't? The opportunity to grow, to thrive, to reach your full human potential should be a God-given right. And for us to reach the levels of success we need, prosperity needs to be systematically available and not that lottery ticket. I think we're all familiar with the limitations of our education system so far. I grew up with the mantra, just go to school and things will work out and you'll secure your future. And by implication, it meant that schooling alone and just being there was important enough to sort everything out. But the reality is not so, because if this were true, then for every year of education and schooling, there would be increased economic returns to that individual. But the stats don't show us that in South Africa. The economic returns to education haven't materialized. This diagram shows the relationship between a person's highest level of education and their employment prospects. We see from this diagram that someone's employment prospects do not materially improve with each year until they get a diploma or a degree. Looking at this diagram, we can see that about 68% of people who never went into an education system become employed, whereas 64% of people that do get an education and get a matric become employed. 68 to 64. 4% difference for 12 years of schooling. That's like being in a COVID-19 vaccine queue and being at the end of that, on the front of that 12-person queue, and instead of calling you from the front, they call anybody else in the queue because you haven't actually gotten an advantage for waiting and investing that time. I believe that the answer isn't simply saying that everybody must go and get a degree or a diploma. Surely, we have to be able to get more out of those 12 years. Traditional schooling made sense when the future of work was predictable and you were able to prepare people for the next 40 years in their career. And now this is changing, not just in South Africa, but in the rest of the world. And this way of schooling doesn't make sense anymore when our careers start to look like this. They're unpredictable. We don't know the jobs that are going to be required in the future, and they're changing all the time. I'm sure we've all heard about the kind of skills of the future that are required. And the World Economic Forum has listed a number of these in 2015 and 2020, and we're starting to see the significant differences. One trick, though, is that I've spoken to a number of people and education leaders and asked them, how do we truly assess someone's ability to critically think, to collaborate? And we don't quite have the clarity that I think we need in order to be able to develop those skills. And then in another 5 years' time, they're going to get even more and more complex. How are we going to grasp that need to develop and measure for these skills? For sure, there have been many developments since my parents were in classrooms like this. Technologists, digital natives, innovators have done some amazing work creating incredible new solutions that cover the entire range of the education value chain, from digital content, online videos, great classroom tools, school administration systems, and to the kind of work that we do at Rekindle Learning in terms of personalized micro-learning. But even when I look at these, I still have to ask myself, are we truly optimizing the learning system, the education system, to build for the skills of the future? We can have every one of these boxes ticked and deliver great digital content, but are we going to be able to build those skills? Are we going to be able to build mindsets, values, behaviors, the kind of stuff that actually makes up those skills? We know that you can give a potential nurse great content, but does it make them a great nurse? It doesn't mean that from the content that will translate, and those abilities are not going to be developed through content. Increasingly, I am more and more convinced that we need to change our paradigm, and we've been missing something. And that education, to be truly successful, isn't just what we learn, but how we learn. We are the product of both the what and the how, yet we have spent an extraordinary amount of effort and time in the what. And if you look at the South African curriculum, in the what, it's not actually that bad, but there's absolutely no guidance on the how. And that is where the major problem stems. The kinds of skills we want, the mindsets and behaviors that we seek are built through experiences, exposure, tackling challenges, through experiential learning. The what of education is no longer sufficient. And now we have to transition to thinking about that how. So the question is, how do we begin to build for these skills? And this is where the investment in education is required. We can start to draw on the learnings from neuroscience that is becoming a lot clearer in terms of how do we develop people and build these kind of complex skills. The big idea here is that through a series of just right experiences, experience or challenge that isn't too simple and too easy that someone gets bored and disengaged, or a challenge that isn't too hard that someone makes excuses, blames someone else, or excuses themselves from the situation. With the just right challenge that someone can undertake, they can then achieve an I can moment. And the neuroscience says that is actually the only form of true learning, because that's the learning that produces and develops a new neural pathway. We now have to transition from curating great content to curating great experiences. And from the time you're born as a child, you actually accumulate a lot of these experiences. And if you're lucky enough to be stimulated at school, at home, your neural pathways will develop incredibly quickly. But what of those that don't have that level of privilege and stimulation? If we're not working towards the creation of these I can moments in education, we're missing a big part. The neuroplasticity concepts really speak to our ability to alter our minds through the kind of experiences that we have. And this is the shift in paradigm that I believe learning and education has to fully grasp. The key here is that when we struggle, but only just the right struggle, then we're able to build those neural pathways and come out of our comfort zones. Luckily for us, there are some people that have been thinking very hard about these kind of concepts. And A to B Transformation is one of those local organizations. And they started thinking about classes of challenges and how we might be able to start to grade the complexity of challenges. An example here is 5 classes of challenge, from A1 being the lowest level of ability to B2 being the highest level of ability. And the thing here is that whatever the task, whether it's parenting or building critical skills, whether it's cleaning the house or project management, can ultimately be graded across these 5 levels. But when I say grade, it's not that A+ or that F, not at all. It's about grading the underlying brain functions, behaviors, and mindsets that are happening. Great teachers and the world-renowned sports coaches have known for a long time how you craft experiences of increasing difficulty to get someone to be an Olympic athlete. And I'm saying that we now need to apply that same curation ability to more academic subjects, like the skills that we're seeing for the future. Let's think about a practical application, a simple example of teaching a child how to ride a bicycle. The scale would probably make common sense to any parent that has actually taught their child to ride. But let's unpack it a bit more. When you look at the first level of A1, the child can't sit or hold on the bike. They keep falling. They've got no knowledge of what actually needs to happen or how to make the bicycle move. But A1 offers a profound learning moment. They come to realize that there is something that they don't know. And if it appeals to them, you suddenly open up the motivation to learn. And if you think about our education system, we don't often make sure that we start with creating that motivation. At the A2 level, we start to see how someone is now keen and wants to learn and get better at the task. And from there, it's really important to give people the level of support and encouragement they need so that the monkey brain or reptilian function doesn't override their ability to learn. And this is where that supportive and encouraging environment plays such a crucial part. The ability to provide, affection, positivity, role models, buddies, to journey someone and tip them to that next level of the A3, where they can finally ride the bicycle on their own. They can observe people doing some cool tricks and copy them. They can drive some of their own learning, and they are consciously competent at this point in time. I like to think of this stage as the part where you need to invest those 10,000 hours to get to the next expert level of B1, where you can self-direct, self-determine. You can even begin to coach and lead other people in becoming great bicyclists too. And ultimately, you get to that B2 level where you're highly ambitious, competitive, you display originality, and you thrive on the complexity of challenges. The key thing that A to B teaches us with this kind of thinking is that learning should be recognized and observed by how someone is behaving at each of those stages. And the next frontier of education is understanding the classes of challenges we need to curate for people to develop creativity, critical thinking, system skills, the curation of experiences at different points along that line to be able to empower people to grow. Understanding the right struggle that someone needs to go through to be able to tip from one point to the other for those really complex skills. That's the challenge of our time. In this diagram, we start to see how the scale relates to our underlying brain functions and learning journey. We start to see how it relates to stages of learning, our level of consciousness, as well as our locus of control, and what we need to develop on a behavior, mindset level to get from A1 to B2. What I love about the stages of learning is that it's stuff that we know from before already, from unconscious incompetence to conscious competence. And we actually do understand the behaviors people display at each of those stages. And then we combine those stages of learning with our brain function of analysis and synthesis. The historical understanding could have been left and right, but we now know that's not so accurate. And what we need to understand here is that our education system focused a lot on the zooming in, the analytical, as opposed to the synthesis, the zooming out, that allows you to see the bigger picture. And we haven't spent enough time understanding how we make sure we integrate your lower brain functions or your monkey brain so that it doesn't override your higher brain functions. What is also most powerful about brain consciousness is that it allows us to address different parts of a challenge. Analytical functions speak to, am I doing the task right? Whereas synthesis functions speak to, am I even doing the right task? By far and away, one of the biggest complaints by employers has really always been that people can't figure out what to do. You've got to give them instructions. The graduates are not able to figure out the problem and decide on the solution from there. And this starts to show us how, with only half a brain consciousness of typically analysis skills, we don't build that whole brain function. And lastly, locus of control speaks to whether you believe life is happening to you as an external locus of control, or whether you believe you're directing your life outcomes with an internalized locus of control. How often do we prime people to believe and develop an external locus of control when we encourage them to only do stuff on instruction, to do as they're told, to be taught a history of Africa that says that everything happened to Africans initiated by Americans and Europeans? How often do we really consider if we're building an internalized locus of control that is so key from getting someone to be a dependent to an independent thinker? And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I really want to implore upon us today is looking at these kinds of classes of challenges. How can we articulate how we build creativity, critical thinking, advanced cognitive skills at each of these levels? What are the toolkits we need to give people in order to be able to tip them to that next level of development? Thank you for joining me, and I hope you now see that the path to transformational education outcomes is going to rely on our ability to curate experiences.